When Sarah and her husband Tom moved into their new suburban home, they thought they had found the perfect place to start their family. It was a quiet neighborhood, with tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and well-kept lawns. The house itself was a charming two-story colonial with a white picket fence, everything they had dreamed of. Their first day was filled with unpacking, organizing, and getting to know the area. As they were setting up their living room, there was a knock at the door. Sarah opened it to find a middle-aged man with graying hair and piercing blue eyes standing on their porch. "Hello, I'm Mr. Harris," the man said with a friendly smile. "I live next door. Welcome to the neighborhood." "Thank you," Sarah replied, shaking his hand. "It's nice to meet you." Harris was polite, but there was something off about him. He lingered too long, his gaze a little too intense. Tom came to the door, and after a brief chat, Harris left, leaving Sarah with an uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach. Over the next few days, Harris seemed to always be around. Whether Sarah was gardening, walking to the car, or simply looking out the window, he was there, either watching her from his porch or coincidentally walking by. It wasn't enough to confront him, but it was unsettling. As the weeks passed, Sarah's unease about their neighbor grew. Harris became a constant presence, always nearby, but never doing anything explicitly wrong. He waved when she left for work in the morning, stood outside when she returned, and seemed to know her routine better than she did. One afternoon, as Sarah was gardening in the backyard, she glanced up to see Harris standing at the fence, watching her. He didn't say anything, just stood there, eyes locked on her. It was as if he were waiting for something, but she had no idea what. "Hi, Mr. Harris," Sarah called, trying to keep her voice light despite the knot in her stomach. "Can I help you with something?" Harris smiled, a thin, unsettling grin that didn't reach his eyes. "No, just admiring your garden," he said before turning and walking away. That night, Sarah told Tom about her concerns. "He's just being friendly," Tom said with a shrug. "He's probably just lonely. We're new here. Maybe he's trying to make a connection." Sarah nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was something in Harris's eyes, something dark and predatory, and the more she thought about it, the more she began to notice other strange things. Items in their yard seemed to move on their own. A chair that had been on the patio would suddenly be in the middle of the lawn, or the garden tools she'd left neatly arranged would be scattered. Once, she found the back gate wide open, though she knew she had closed it the night before. She started to wonder if Harris was sneaking into their yard while they slept. Sarah's suspicions grew as she noticed more unsettling signs. At night, she often heard creaks and rustles coming from outside their bedroom window, sounds that made her heart race with fear. When she mentioned it to Tom, he brushed it off as the house settling or animals in the yard, but Sarah wasn't convinced. One evening, as she was closing the blinds, she saw a figure standing in Harris's yard, staring directly at their house. It was too dark to make out his features, but Sarah knew it was him. She felt her breath catch in her throat, and she quickly shut the blinds, her hands trembling. "Tom," she whispered, her voice shaky. "He's watching us again." Tom peered through the blinds, but didn't see anyone. "You're imagining things, Sarah," he said, trying to reassure her. "You need to relax." But Sarah knew what she saw. The next morning, she found a small footprint outside their back door, a single print in the damp earth. It was too small to be Tom's, and neither of them had been outside the night before. Sarah's heart raced. Someone had been in their yard. Someone was getting closer. Sarah's anxiety reached a breaking point when she found their bedroom window unlocked one morning. She was certain she had locked it the night before, yet there it was, open just a crack, as if someone had tried to get inside. Her mind raced with fear and paranoia. Was Harris breaking into their home at night? Was he watching them as they slept? She couldn't shake the image of his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, staring at her through the darkness. Sarah called the police, but they told her there was nothing they could do without evidence. Harris hadn't done anything illegal, and they couldn't arrest someone for being creepy. Frustrated and scared, Sarah installed security cameras around the house, hoping to catch him in the act. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, her heart pounded with anticipation. She couldn't sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of what might happen. Hours passed in silence until around 3 a.m., She heard the sound of footsteps outside her window. Her blood ran cold. Sarah reached for her phone, pulling up the live feed from the security cameras. At first, the screen was blank, just the dark outline of their yard. But then she saw him. Harris was standing in their backyard, staring up at their bedroom window, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, watching. Sarah's hands shook as she dialed 911. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's outside." The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, Harris was gone. They searched the yard and the surrounding area but found no sign of him. Sarah was terrified. He had been so close, right outside their window, and she had no idea what he was planning to do. The police suggested they file a restraining order, but without solid proof of any wrongdoing, it would be difficult to enforce. Sarah and Tom were left feeling vulnerable and exposed. For the next few days, Harris didn't show his face. It was as if he had disappeared completely, and Sarah began to wonder if he had finally given up. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. She could still feel his presence, lurking just out of sight. Then, one evening, as they were sitting down for dinner, there was a knock at the door. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She didn't want to answer it, but Tom insisted. When they opened the door, they found Harris standing on the porch, holding a gift basket filled with wine and snacks. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I didn't mean to scare you. I've been dealing with some personal issues, and I realize I may have come across as strange." Sarah's skin crawled at the sight of him, but Tom, always the peacemaker, accepted the basket with a smile. "Thanks, Harris," he said. "We appreciate it." But Sarah didn't believe a word of it. There was something off about the way he spoke, the way his eyes flickered with something dark and dangerous. She knew this wasn't over. That night, as they were getting ready for bed, Sarah heard a noise from the backyard. Footsteps, followed by the sound of something scraping against the side of the house. Her heart raced as she checked the security cameras, but the feed was blank. The cameras had been disabled. Panic surged through her. She grabbed Tom, and they rushed to the back door, locking it just as the doorknob began to turn. Someone was trying to get in. "Call the police," Sarah shouted, her voice trembling with fear. Tom dialed 911 as they barricaded themselves in the bedroom, listening as the sounds of footsteps grew louder, moving through the house. Whoever was inside wasn't trying to hide anymore. They heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor, followed by a low, menacing voice. "I warned you," the voice said. "I warned you to leave." Sarah's blood ran cold. It was Harris. As Sarah and Tom huddled in their bedroom, listening to the unmistakable sound of Harris moving through their home, fear surged through every nerve in Sarah's body. The sinister tone of Harris's voice echoed in her mind. "I warned you to leave." His words had taken on a terrifying weight, and now they were face to face with the consequence of ignoring the danger. Tom, trying to stay calm, barricaded the bedroom door with a dresser, his hands shaking as he pushed it into place. Sarah clutched her phone, watching the seconds tick by after calling 911, hoping the police would arrive before Harris reached them. But every minute felt like an eternity. Suddenly there was a loud bang on the door. Harris was trying to get in. The sound of him slamming his fists against the door filled the room, each thud louder than the last. The door shook violently under the force, and Sarah could feel the weight of fear pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. "Let me in," Harris growled from the other side of the door. "You can't hide from me." Sarah backed up against the wall, her entire body trembling with terror. She could see the door bowing slightly with each hit, and she knew it wouldn't hold much longer. "Tom," she whispered, her voice quivering. "He's going to get in." Tom grabbed a baseball bat from the closet, his face pale but determined. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low and steady, though she could hear the fear behind it. The pounding continued, relentless and unforgiving, until suddenly it stopped. There was a moment of eerie silence, too quiet, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Then, without warning, the window shattered. Glass rained down across the room as Harris climbed through, his eyes wild with rage. He lunged toward them, but Tom swung the bat, catching him in the side. Harris stumbled, but it barely seemed to slow him down. "Get out," Tom yelled, swinging the bat again. But Harris was too fast. He ducked under the bat and grabbed Tom by the throat, slamming him against the wall with terrifying strength. Sarah screamed, rushing forward, trying to pull Harris off her husband, but he was too strong. His grip tightened around Tom's neck, and Tom's face turned a sickly shade of purple as he struggled to breathe. In a desperate move, Sarah grabbed a lamp from the bedside table and smashed it over Harris's head. The ceramic lamp shattered, and Harris stumbled, loosening his grip on Tom just enough for him to break free. Tom gasped for air, his hand clutching his throat as he staggered back. Sarah pulled him toward the door, her heart racing. They had to get out, now. Sarah and Tom bolted out of the room, running down the stairs as fast as their legs would carry them. Behind them, they could hear Harris recovering, the sound of his footsteps pounding against the floor as he gave chase. They reached the front door, but as Tom fumbled with the lock, Harris was already halfway down the stairs. He was coming for them, his eyes blazing with murderous intent. "Come on, come on," Sarah urged, her voice filled with panic. Finally, the door swung open and they ran out into the night, sprinting toward the street just as the flashing lights of a police car appeared at the end of the block. Relief washed over Sarah as the officers jumped out of the car, guns drawn, and rushed toward them. "Harris is in the house," Sarah shouted, pointing toward their front door. "He tried to kill us." The officers stormed into the house, and moments later, they dragged Harris out in handcuffs. His face was a mask of fury, but he didn't say a word. As the officers pushed him into the back of the squad car, Harris turned his head, locking eyes with Sarah one last time. His lips curled into a slow, menacing smile, and in that moment Sarah knew that this wasn't over. Harris might be gone for now, but the terror he had unleashed would haunt her forever. When Claire and her husband Mark moved into their new duplex, they felt like their lives were finally turning around. The place was perfect, spacious, affordable, and close to Mark's new job. The only catch was that it was a shared building, and they'd have neighbors living in the unit upstairs. At first, the family who lived above them seemed perfectly normal. They were quiet and kept to themselves. Occasionally, Claire would hear footsteps or muffled conversations from upstairs, but nothing out of the ordinary. However, it didn't take long for strange things to start happening. It began with small, almost unnoticeable events. One evening, Claire heard what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor above her. But when she saw the family the next day, they seemed as friendly as ever. As the weeks passed, though, the disturbances became more frequent. Loud thumps in the middle of the night, strange scratching noises in the walls, and worst of all, an odd rhythmic tapping sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Do you hear that?" Claire asked Mark one night as they lay in bed, listening to the strange sounds from upstairs. Mark shrugged. "It's an old building, probably just the pipes or something." But Claire wasn't convinced. There was something about the noises that felt wrong, like they weren't just natural sounds, but intentional. One night she decided to confront the family upstairs. Claire stood at the bottom of the stairs leading up to the unit above her, her heart racing as she rehearsed what she would say. What do you even ask someone when you suspect they're doing something strange? She hesitated for a moment before finally knocking on the door. At first, there was no answer. Just as she was about to turn and leave, the door creaked open. Standing there was the father of the family, a tall, thin man with pale skin and dark, sunken eyes. His clothes hung loosely off his frame, as though he hadn't eaten well in months. "Yes?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper. "I'm sorry to bother you," Claire began, "but we've been hearing some unusual noises coming from your apartment late at night. It's been keeping us up, and I was wondering if everything is okay." The man blinked, as if the question confused him. "Noises?" he repeated slowly. "I don't think we've made any noise." Claire felt a chill run down her spine at his expression. His eyes didn't seem to fully focus on her, and there was something unsettling about his demeanor. "Well, we've heard things being dragged around, tapping noises, and it's been happening almost every night," she explained, trying to keep her voice steady. The man continued to stare at her for what felt like an eternity before finally nodding. "I'll tell my family to be more careful. We've had some things going on, but it's nothing for you to worry about." Before Claire could say anything else, he closed the door. She stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, unsure of what to make of the encounter. As she turned to leave, the feeling of being watched crept over her, and when she looked up at one of the windows, she thought she saw someone, perhaps the wife, peering down at her from behind the curtains. Over the next few days, Claire tried to ignore the strange encounter, telling herself it was just her imagination running wild. But then the disturbances got worse, much worse. One night, while Mark was working late, Claire was home alone when the tapping sound started again, louder this time. It echoed through the walls, coming from different parts of the house, moving quickly as if something were crawling around inside the walls. She grabbed her phone and dialed Mark. "Mark, you won't believe this, but the noises are back. It's louder, and I swear it sounds like it's inside the walls now." "Claire, it's an old house," Mark replied, his voice calm. "The pipes are probably just settling, or there might be some rats in the walls." "Rats don't tap in rhythmic patterns," Claire snapped, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. Mark sighed. "I'll be home soon. We can look into it together, okay? Just hang tight." As soon as she hung up, the power went out. Suddenly, the house was plunged into darkness. Claire's breath hitched as she stood frozen in place. The only sound now was the blood rushing in her ears. She reached for the flashlight on her phone and flicked it on, her hands trembling. The tapping had stopped, but now there was something else. A faint scratching like nails dragging along the floor. Claire's heart pounded as she aimed the flashlight toward the kitchen, where the sound was coming from. She could hear the scratching growing louder, closer. "Mark," she whispered under her breath, wishing he were there. The sound stopped abruptly, followed by a creaking noise, like someone or something shifting its weight in the darkness just out of sight. Gathering all her courage, Claire slowly walked toward the kitchen. Her mind raced, imagining the worst possible scenarios. But when she entered, she found nothing. Everything was exactly where it should be, except for one thing. The door to the basement was slightly ajar, even though she was certain she had locked it earlier. Claire stared at the basement door, her mind reeling. Had she left it open? Or had someone, opened it from the inside? Her first instinct was to shut the door and wait for Mark to come home, but something inside her urged her to go down there. Against her better judgment, she stepped closer, every fiber of her being screaming to turn around, to call someone, anyone. But she couldn't stop herself. She opened the door wider and shone her flashlight down the stairs. The beam of light cut through the thick darkness, revealing nothing but the wooden steps descending into the pitch-black abyss below. Her foot hovered over the first step, hesitation gripping her, but she forced herself to continue. Each step creaked ominously under her weight as she descended into the cold, musty basement. When she reached the bottom, she shone the light around. The basement was mostly empty, save for a few old boxes and pieces of furniture the previous tenants had left behind. But something was off. The air down here felt different, heavier, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. And then she saw it. In the far corner of the basement, scratched into the concrete floor, were strange symbols, intricate and foreign, like something out of a nightmare. Claire's heart raced as she crouched down to examine them. They looked old, but recent enough that the scratches were still fresh. But what truly terrified her was the realization that these markings hadn't been there when they first moved in. Just as she leaned in closer, the basement door slammed shut behind her, plunging her into complete darkness. Claire's scream echoed through the basement as she dropped her phone, its flashlight spinning wildly as it hit the floor. She scrambled to pick it up, her hands shaking, heart racing. She was now trapped in the basement. Frantically, she grabbed the phone and aimed the light toward the stairs, but the door remained shut. She tried to push down the rising panic, telling herself that the wind must have slammed it shut, but deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Turning her light back toward the strange symbols, she noticed something else. There were faint markings on the walls as well. They looked like claw marks, as if something had tried to scratch its way out from inside the walls. Claire backed away, the oppressive feeling in the room growing stronger. Just then, her phone buzzed in her hand, an incoming call from Mark. "Claire? I'm almost home. Are you okay?" His voice brought a wave of relief, but the fear still gripped her tightly. "Mark, you have to hurry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's something wrong. The basement, it's not normal. There are symbols, scratches." Before she could finish, the phone cut off. The signal was gone. Suddenly, the scratching sound returned, this time louder, coming from directly behind her. Slowly, Claire turned, the light of her phone shaking as she aimed it toward the source of the noise. In the far corner of the basement, she saw movement, shadows twisting and shifting, taking form. It wasn't her imagination. Something was in the basement with her. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the shifting shadows in the corner. Her phone's light flickered, casting eerie shapes across the basement walls. The air was thick with an unnatural energy, and the scratching sound intensified, now louder, more deliberate. Whatever was in the basement with her was getting closer. She backed away slowly, her hands trembling as she tried to keep the flashlight steady. "I need to get out of here." The thought pounded in her head, but her feet felt like they were glued to the cold concrete floor. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to move, to run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the corner. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, something began to emerge from the darkness. At first, it was just a silhouette, a figure barely visible in the dim light. But as it stepped closer, Claire could make out its features. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, spindly arms that seemed to stretch beyond human proportions. Its skin was a pale, sickly white, and its eyes, those eyes, were dark, empty pits that bore into her soul. It moved slowly, methodically, as if it knew that Claire was trapped. The scratching sound wasn't coming from its hands, but from its feet, which scraped against the floor with every step. Claire's heart raced, her mind screaming at her to do something, anything. But she was frozen in place, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. The creature's mouth slowly twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of jagged, sharp teeth. "Help. Me," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Suddenly, the creature lunged at her, its long arms reaching out. Claire screamed, turning and racing toward the stairs. Her legs felt like jelly as she stumbled, nearly tripping over the steps. She reached the top and threw herself against the door, pounding on it with all her might. "Mark, help me!" she screamed, her voice hoarse with terror. Just as the creature's hand brushed her ankle, the door flew open and Claire tumbled into the hallway. Mark stood there wide-eyed, his face pale. "What the hell?" Mark began. But before he could finish, the basement door slammed shut again with such force that the entire house seemed to shake. Claire scrambled to her feet, breathing heavily. "We have to leave, Mark. There's something in the basement, something evil." Mark looked at her, then at the basement door, his face a mixture of confusion and fear. "What are you talking about?" "I'm serious," Claire shouted, grabbing his arm. "There's something down there. I saw it." Mark hesitated, his rational mind warring with the panic in Claire's voice. "All right," he said finally. "We're leaving. We'll call someone in the morning." They rushed out of the house, slamming the front door behind them. Claire's heart pounded as she fumbled with the keys, locking the door as quickly as possible. She glanced up at the window of the upstairs apartment, half expecting to see the shadowy figure watching her. But it was empty. They drove in silence, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy in the air. Neither of them spoke until they were miles away from the house, parked at a gas station. The next day, Claire and Mark returned to the house with a professional paranormal investigator, a man named Jacob who had been recommended by a friend. He was tall, with a calm, authoritative demeanor that put Claire at ease. As they stood in front of the basement door, Jacob carefully unpacked his equipment, a series of cameras, sensors, and devices Claire didn't recognize. "You say the disturbances started a few weeks ago?" Jacob asked, setting up his equipment. "Yeah," Claire replied, glancing nervously at the door. "But it's gotten worse recently. We've heard noises, and I saw something in the basement." Jacob nodded, his expression serious. A lot of old houses have residual energy, but this sounds like something more. Let's see what we're dealing with. He opened the basement door and without hesitation descended the stairs. Claire and Mark followed, the oppressive feeling from the previous night returning as they stepped into the cold, musty air of the basement. Jacob scanned the room with one of his devices, which beeped softly as it picked up electromagnetic readings. "There's definitely something here," he murmured. Then he saw the symbols on the floor. These markings. Jacob crouched down, tracing the symbols with his finger. They're part of an ancient ritual. Whoever lived here before may have dabbled in something dark, something they didn't fully understand. Claire's stomach churned. "You mean like a curse?" "Possibly," Jacob said. "But it's more likely they summoned something, and whatever it is, it's still here." He stood up, looking around the room. "We need to cleanse this space. I'll perform a ritual to banish the entity, but you need to be prepared. Things might get worse before they get better." The ritual began that night. Jacob set up candles and incense in the basement, chanting words in a language Claire didn't understand. As the ritual progressed, the temperature in the room dropped, and the oppressive energy became almost unbearable. Suddenly, the lights flickered and the scratching noise returned, louder, more insistent. The candles flickered wildly, and the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang. "Stay close," Jacob shouted, his voice strained as he continued the ritual. Claire and Mark huddled together, their hearts racing. The shadows in the corner began to move again, swirling and twisting into the shape of the creature Claire had seen before. It was angry. The entity lunged toward Jacob, but he held his ground, chanting louder, his voice growing stronger with each word. The creature recoiled, its form flickering like a glitch in reality. For what felt like an eternity, Jacob battled the entity, his chants ringing out against the oppressive darkness. Finally, with one last powerful word, the creature let out a shriek and dissolved into nothingness, the basement falling into an eerie silence. The oppressive energy lifted and the air seemed lighter, almost peaceful. Jacob lowered his arms, exhausted but triumphant. "It's over," he said, turning to Claire and Mark. "The house is cleansed, but I'd recommend moving just in case. Sometimes these things leave a residue." Claire nodded, relief flooding over her. She knew one thing for sure: they were never coming back to this house again. When Eric and Sarah finally bought their first home, it felt like a dream come true. The house was nestled in a quiet neighborhood, with a small garden and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. After years of saving and searching, they were ready to settle down and start a family. As they unpacked boxes in their new home, everything seemed perfect. The neighbors were polite, though they kept to themselves. The couple noticed that most of the other houses were dimly lit and rarely had visitors. Sarah thought it was a bit odd, but brushed it off as a sign of a peaceful, quiet neighborhood. "This place is so calm," Sarah said one evening, as they sat on the back porch sipping coffee. "Almost too calm." Eric smiled. "That's the whole point, isn't it? After all the chaos of the city, a little peace and quiet is exactly what we need." Sarah nodded, though something about the stillness unsettled her. There was barely any noise, no cars passing by, no dogs barking, not even the distant hum of traffic. It was almost as if the neighborhood was asleep. One evening, as they unpacked more boxes in the living room, Sarah glanced out the front window and saw their neighbors, the Wilsons, standing in their driveway. It was strange because she had never seen them outside before. They were just standing there, completely still, staring at their house. "Eric, come look at this," she whispered. Eric walked over, his brow furrowed. "What are they doing?" "I don't know. They're just standing there, watching us." For a moment, the couple stood in silence, watching the neighbors who showed no sign of moving. Then, without warning, the Wilsons turned around in unison and walked back into their house. "That was weird," Sarah said, feeling a chill run down her spine. Eric tried to laugh it off. Maybe they're just curious about the new people on the block. But Sarah couldn't shake the eerie feeling that lingered after the strange encounter. Something about the neighborhood, the neighbors, felt off. Days passed, and the unsettling feeling only grew stronger. The neighborhood remained deathly quiet. Sarah noticed that none of the neighbors seemed to leave their houses during the day. In fact, she hadn't seen anyone outside since the night the Wilsons stared at their home. The silence weighed heavily on Sarah. She tried to focus on unpacking, but every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. When she looked, there was nothing there, just the stillness of their empty street. One night, as Eric worked late, Sarah decided to explore the neighborhood on her own. She walked down the street, hoping to meet some of the other neighbors, but every house she passed was dark, the windows covered by heavy curtains. No one was outside. There were no lights, no sounds. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Sarah's steps slowed as she reached the end of the street. There, she saw a figure standing at the edge of a driveway. An older man, his back to her, his head slightly tilted as if he was listening to something. "Excuse me?" Sarah called out, her voice echoing in the silence. "Do you live around here?" The man didn't respond. He stood perfectly still, not even acknowledging her presence. Sarah's heart began to race. She took a step closer. "Hello? Are you okay?" Suddenly the man turned his head, just slightly, but enough for Sarah to see the side of his face. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were wide, unblinking. He stared at her for a moment before slowly turning back toward the house and walking inside, the door closing with an eerie creak. Sarah stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. Something was terribly wrong with this neighborhood. That night, Sarah told Eric about her strange encounter with the man at the end of the street. Eric frowned, but he was quick to dismiss it. "Maybe he's just old and confused," he suggested. "We shouldn't jump to conclusions." Sarah wanted to believe him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beneath the surface of this quiet neighborhood. The following evening, as they prepared for bed, Sarah heard a faint tapping sound coming from the living room. She paused, listening closely. There it was again, a soft, rhythmic tapping like someone was knocking gently on the window. "Eric, do you hear that?" she whispered. Eric nodded, his face tense. He grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the living room, Sarah following closely behind. As they reached the window, the tapping stopped. Eric shone the flashlight outside, but there was nothing there. Just the empty street and the dim glow of a streetlight. "Probably just the wind," Eric muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. But Sarah knew it wasn't the wind. She had felt something, a presence, watching them from outside. That night, Sarah struggled to sleep. Every creak of the house, every shift in the shadows sent her heart racing. She could feel eyes on her, though every time she looked out the window, the street was empty. A few nights later, Eric and Sarah were woken by a loud banging at their front door. Eric jumped out of bed, grabbing a bat from the closet. Sarah followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who could it be at this hour?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. As they reached the door, the banging stopped. Eric looked through the peephole, but there was no one there. He slowly unlocked the door and opened it, but the street was empty, bathed in an eerie silence. Just as Eric was about to close the door, Sarah saw something move in the distance. "There," she whispered, pointing to the end of the street. A group of their neighbors stood in the road, staring at their house, motionless. It was the same as before, dozens of them, just standing there, watching. "What the hell is wrong with them?" Eric muttered, stepping outside to get a closer look. Suddenly, as if on cue, the neighbors turned in unison and walked back into their homes, disappearing behind closed doors. Eric turned to Sarah, his face pale. "This is getting seriously creepy." "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Something's not right here." But Eric wasn't ready to give up on their new home just yet. "Let's just get through tonight," he said. trying to sound calm. "We'll figure it out in the morning." The next day, Sarah was cleaning the upstairs hallway when she noticed something strange about one of the walls. There was a thin crack running along the edge, as if there was a hidden door behind the wallpaper. Curious, she grabbed a knife and carefully peeled back the wallpaper, revealing a small, concealed door. "Eric, come here," she called. Eric rushed upstairs, and together they pried the door open. Inside was a small, dusty room filled with old, decaying furniture and strange, faded photographs. In one corner, there was a photo of the house, but it looked different, older, darker, and standing in front of it were several people, all with blank, expressionless faces. "These are our neighbors," Sarah whispered, holding up the photo. "Look." But Eric was focused on something else. In the center of the room, there was a small wooden box. He opened it, revealing a collection of strange, ritualistic objects, candles, symbols carved into pieces of bone, and a diary written in a language neither of them could understand. Eric stared at the ritualistic objects in the box, his hands shaking slightly as he set the lid aside. The room, filled with dust and stale air, seemed to grow colder the longer they stood inside. Sarah, still holding the photograph of their eerie, expressionless neighbors, felt a gnawing dread building in her chest. "We need to get out of here," Sarah whispered, stepping backward toward the hallway. This feels wrong." Eric nodded slowly, but something in his eyes had changed. He seemed more entranced by the strange objects in the box, almost as if they were calling to him. "We have to know what this is," Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just some old stuff left behind. It feels significant." "No, Eric. We need to leave this house, leave this neighborhood before something terrible happens," Sarah urged, tugging at his arm. Eric hesitated for a moment before reluctantly closing the box and setting it aside. "Okay, but we should keep this in case we need to show someone." Sarah wasn't sure that was a good idea, but she didn't argue. Her gut was screaming at her to leave the room, the house, and never look back. As they exited the hidden space, they both felt as if they were being watched, though the house was still and quiet. That night, sleep did not come easily. Sarah tossed and turned, haunted by images of their neighbors standing outside in the darkness. The blank faces from the photograph burned into her mind. Eric, meanwhile, had brought the strange box into their bedroom, setting it on the dresser where it loomed in the shadows. At around 3 a.m., a low, creaking sound echoed through the house. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart racing. The sound was coming from downstairs, like someone slowly walking across the living room floor. "Eric," she whispered, shaking him awake. He blinked groggily, confused for a moment. "What? What is it?" "Someone's downstairs." Eric's face hardened, and he reached for the bat he had left beside the bed. Together they crept down the stairs, moving as quietly as possible. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, they saw the front door was wide open. The cool night air blew into the house, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic. Eric stepped forward, gripping the bat tightly. "Who's there?" He called out into the darkness. There was no answer. But then, from the shadows outside, a figure stepped forward. It was one of their neighbors, the same man Sarah had seen standing at the end of the street a few days ago. He stood just beyond the doorway, his face blank, his eyes unblinking. Behind him, more figures emerged from the darkness. The Wilsons, the elderly couple from across the street, and others Sarah hadn't yet met. All of them stood there, staring at the open door, their faces as lifeless as the ones in the photograph. "What do you want?" Eric demanded, his voice shaking as he raised the bat. The figures said nothing. They just stood there, their presence oppressive and unnerving. Then, as if on some unspoken command, they all turned and began to walk away, disappearing back into the shadows. Eric slowly closed the door and locked it, his hands trembling. "This is getting worse," he muttered. "We need to find out what the hell is going on." Sarah was at a loss for words. She felt trapped, like the walls of the house were closing in on her. Every instinct told her to leave, but where would they go in the middle of the night? And what if the neighbors followed them? The following day, Eric decided to dig deeper into the box they had found. He sat at the kitchen table, poring over the strange diary, hoping to find some clue as to what was happening in the neighborhood. The writing was in an unfamiliar language, but there were symbols and drawings that seemed to tell a story. A ritual, a pact, something ancient and dark. "This isn't just some weird cult thing," Eric said, flipping through the pages. "I think the people here, and they're part of it. This neighborhood, the house, it's all connected." Sarah stared at the symbols, a knot tightening in her stomach. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Eric admitted, "but it looks like the people here made some kind of deal. Something to do with eternal life or maybe protection, but it came at a cost." Sarah shuddered. "What kind of cost?" Before Eric could answer, they heard a loud thud from the front door. Startled, they both stood up and hurried to see what it was. When they opened the door, they found a note pinned to the wood with a rusted nail. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and the writing was the same strange script from the diary. "We have to leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Whatever this is, we can't stay here any longer." Eric agreed. He grabbed his phone and began searching for hotels or nearby places where they could spend the night, just until they figured out their next move. But as they packed their bags, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Sarah looked out the window and saw their neighbors standing at the edge of their yard, silently watching, waiting. As night fell, Eric and Sarah rushed to get out of the house, throwing essentials into their bags. But as they reached the front door, they found it blocked by their neighbors, dozens of them now, standing in the driveway, their blank faces illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights. "They're not going to let us leave," Sarah whispered, panic rising in her voice. Eric grabbed the bat again, his knuckles white with fear. "We'll have to make a run for it." But just as they prepared to dash through the door, the lights in the house flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The air grew thick with a cold, oppressive energy, and Sarah felt a heavy presence settling over the house. From the corner of the room, a shadow shifted. It wasn't one of the neighbors, it was something else, something darker and more sinister. It moved toward them, its form barely visible in the gloom, but its presence was undeniable. Eric swung the bat wildly, but it passed through the shadow like smoke. The figure loomed over them, and Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. She realized with horrifying clarity that this was what the neighbors were protecting, the darkness that lived within the house, feeding on the lives of those who moved in. As the shadow closed in, Eric and Sarah felt a cold chill envelop them, freezing them in place. The last thing they saw was the door creaking open, and their neighbors stepping inside, their faces as blank and lifeless as ever.